Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and that was Little Nas X with Montero coming straight at you from the car radio. And we're just doing a bit of cruising, holding off on the boozing. And I wanted to make a little offering for you regarding Luke chapter 22, verses 28 and 29, I believe it is. And the question was posed, or the comment was made by a man named Dustin. And Dustin's been a follower of my channel for a while now. And he asked this question the other day and said, or suggested that I make a video on this because it would back up IO nicely. And he's absolutely right. It does back up IO very nicely. I've talked about it a lot in videos. I can't remember if I've done anything recently, but this is one of the best proof texts right out of the mouth of Jesus, actually. And it basically shows the whole kingdom deliverance. It shows the whole identity of those in the kingdom, and it just wraps it all up in a nice nutshell for you. Puts a little bow on it. So it's Luke chapter 22, verse 28. Jesus says this to the disciples. He says, "But you are those who have continued with me in my trials. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel." So Jesus makes a very interesting statement here, talking about the disciples being those who have continued with him through his trials. And when I think about that, I think about, like Peter in Acts, I think it was, saying through much tribulation, we must enter, or we will enter the kingdom of God. Well, we'll get back to that in a minute. Also, we see in places like Matthew 24, where Jesus talks about, the great tribulation of those last days, and so Jesus is saying, you are those who have continued with me in my trials. He's speaking to the disciples, and he says, and I will bestow upon you a kingdom, just as my Father bestowed one upon me. Now, the kingdom there, right? Who is the kingdom? Well, I usually like to look at Luke chapter 1. I think it's verses 30 to 33. Let's see. Let's try to get over there. Hold on. Bear with me one moment, folks. Luckily, I'm kind of stuck in traffic right now, so I can pull this off. Let's take a Gandarewski here. KJV is the first one that popped up, so that's what we're going to click on. And it's Luke chapter 1, verses roughly 31, I think. Yeah, 31. It says, "And behold, you shall conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus." Okay, and then he goes on, he says, "He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David." So, first of all, who did David, right? It's using King David as sort of a comparison to Jesus and what his throne would be. But the question I always like to ask people is, who did King David rule over? Did King David rule over the entire world, or was he ruling over the kingdom of Israel? I think you know the answer. And so that's just something to take notice of here, as it talks about Jesus being given the throne of his father David, right? It's interesting that it says his father, right? The descendant argument, right? Was that spiritual? Was Jesus the spiritual descendant of King David? No. And then we go on, and here's the key. Verse 33, it says, "And he," speaking of Jesus, "shall reign over the house of Israel forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end." Okay, so those are equivalent statements. He shall reign over the house of Israel forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. It's basically telling you that the house of Israel is his kingdom. That's what it's telling you. I'll read it again. Pick up on it. "And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." So you see how if you read it in the proper tone and in the proper flow, keeping the proper context in mind, you can see that this is all about the restoration of Israel, and they are the kingdom. right? When we think about, what did Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15? He said, what's the order of the resurrections? He said, Christ the first fruits, then those who are Christ at his coming. Then comes the end, when he will deliver the kingdom and hand over the kingdom to God the Father, right? That's basically what it says. So again, who's the kingdom that Christ is handing over at his coming? It's the house of Israel. It's the house of Jacob. That's what Luke 1 clearly says. And so let's take a bouncerooski back over to Luke chapter 22 and check out verse 29 again. And I bestow upon you a kingdom, that's the house of Israel, of course, just as my Father bestowed one upon me, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. Okay, that's obviously wedding feast language. We know that's peppered throughout the pages. And we know that Israel is the bride, right? They're always the bride. In the Old Testament, look at Hosea. God divorces the bride, but he talks about remarrying a new bride. And when we see this new bride in the end prepared for God, adorned and all that, it's obviously about Israel. And then verse 30, it says, we just read that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. But here's the kicker. He finishes it off, Jesus does, by saying this, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's interesting that the disciples are being told that in the kingdom that they're going to be given, they're going to be judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? There's no mention of any other peoples in view. There's no mention of all the nations. There's no mention of all the world. There's no mention of, endless gospel missions. No, it's just, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, right? It's pretty ideal, right? I mean, it doesn't give you much of an insight as to what that actually looks like or what that means, which is another reason why I think this is just someone's creative story made up. But yeah, so that's all it was about. It was about the 12 tribes of Israel. In the age to come, they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. That's what Matthew's account says. Matthew 19, Jesus said to them, truly I tell you, in the renewal of all things, I must be reading a weird translation there. I think it says in the age to come, or in the regeneration, or the resurrection. Actually, yeah, it says in the resurrection. Truly I say to you that in the resurrection, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, speaking to the 12 apostles, he's saying, hey, in the regeneration, which is the resurrection, in the age to come, that's the resurrection, the age to come, same thing. When the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones. Those are the 12 apostles. Of course, one representing each of the 12 tribes. And then he says, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So, pretty crystal clear stuff here, people. Pretty crystal clear stuff, right? What about 2 Timothy? If we endure, we will also reign with him. I mean, what about, Revelation, where it says, those who overcome the tribulation, to them belong something. You know the verse. I'm just paraphrasing now. But, I mean, everything shows that there was an end coming. Everything shows that the ones that were partaking in this last days story, they were the ones that had to persevere. They were the ones that had to overcome. The book of John is supposedly written to real churches who would have to overcome this, this final time. And obviously, anyone with a brain and 2 eyeballs, you don't even need 2 eyeballs, actually. You can just have no eyeballs, as long as you have a brain, can see that the mother of all harlots, the mother of all harlots in Revelation is Old Covenant Jerusalem. There's no 2 ways about it. There's no ifs, ands, or big old ghetto booties. All right? It is Old Covenant Jerusalem, 150%. The mother of all harlots, the city where the Lord was slain. Where was the Lord slain? Yep, you guessed it, Jerusalem. Why was this place described as a place that was drunk off the blood of the martyrs and the prophets? Well, because If you recall, Jesus, when he came on the scene and started condemning Jerusalem, he wept over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who have stoned the prophets and sent and killed the ones that I sent to you," etc. "How I wish I could have gathered you back, but you didn't want to come," blah, blah, blah. So clearly we see that, and obviously if we're looking at this from a geographical standpoint, as in the land of Israel, dating all the way back throughout the prior generations and the prior fathers and their histories, we can see that their ancestors, their fathers were actually killed and murdered on that land, dating as back as Cain, as far back as Cain and Abel, right? Abel was killed in the same geographical location, in my opinion, the Promised Land, and that's what Jesus is sort of referring to, I can't imagine that he didn't have Cain and Abel in mind, because he actually brings up Cain and Abel to the Pharisees, and he calls Cain that their father. He says, "Your father," whatever, the verse. I'm totally paraphrasing, but fact check me on this. Jesus absolutely calls Cain the father of the satanic, adversarial, Pharisaical Jews in those last days. So there is a connection. Jesus wanted you to know that Abel's blood crying out was related, okay? And it was related, I believe, geographically to that Promised Land area. And so there's a lot that can be said, but I'm getting a little off topic here. The point that I wanted to just focus on and make sure everybody understands is that Jesus makes a promise to the 12 disciples that in the age to come, in the resurrection, they would sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. My question would be, where the heck is everybody else? Right? Where are all these nations? And since we know that that kingdom would be delivered back to God in the end, right? Paul says that clearly in 1 Corinthians 15. And we know that Paul ties the resurrection of all those who are Christ's to that deliverance of the kingdom back to God. So if all those who are Christ would be raised by the time of Christ's coming and that deliverance of the kingdom back to God, then clearly that makes nobody today possible to be one of Christ. It just can't work. That's just how it goes. So that shows clearly that this was actually, like Luke 1 says, the kingdom actually was the house of Israel, the house of Jacob, right? That's the kingdom. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging 2 tribes of Israel. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging 10 tribes of Israel. They're not sitting on 12 thrones judging the Jews and a bunch of nations. No, they're sitting on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. It's pretty simple stuff. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, I hope it was satisfactory. I hope it gets your mind thinking in the right direction on a lot of these things. And we'll catch you on another episode sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.